even stopped revolutions like a potential one happening in France in '68. In terms of, okay, I've just been told we were being recorded. Anyway, so I keep these things in mind when we talk about Paulo Freire 100 years on. Now, let me make this clear. I mean, it's amazing how Paulo Freire keeps being celebrated and his ideas keep being re-echoed throughout time. Maybe we put also our own ideas into Paulo Freire. You know, we look at situations and we give it a Freirean reading, which is a great thing. I mean, we can talk about a Freirean lens, just like we talk about a Foucauldian lens, or some people talk about a Derridian lens, or now a Judith Butler lens, etc. in more recent years. And which is a great thing. And I've even been seeing people talking about, even now, looking at literature from this perspective. I mean, Peter Roberts is a classic example, looking at works by Hess and other people from a Freirean perspective. So, you know, we can talk about, okay, that we tend to romanticize these figures, but Paulo Freire has emerged from popular education, but is now a person who is taken seriously in a variety of fields, you know, radical theology, anthropology, you name it, sociology, of course, philosophy, etc. And you know, offers a lens on how to read the world, which is, after all, what he was always on about. It was more reading the world than simply reading the word. And to see Freire now even used in areas like literature, I mean, it was great for Gramsci to be, because Gramsci has written a lot about literature, but also now Paulo Freire to be talked up a lot in that vein is interesting. It shows how, you know, like how popular education has provided us with a number of people who have gone beyond simply the popular education field. I mean, probably most famous example, I'm seeing Ian Martin. I know he's very fond of him, like me, and Emilio too, and others, I'm sure here. Raymond Williams, you know, Raymond Williams, a Cambridge, of course, graduate, and not your run-of-the-mill graduate, a brilliant graduate who dedicated most of his life to adult education. It was only late in his life that he went to Cambridge as a full-time professor, because he was involved with the Oxford Delicacy for Extramural Studies, and from which I would say the first wave of cultural studies emerged. And it was connected with the struggles of the working class. Then it became a form of radical chic across the Atlantic when it was taken up by the mainstream universities. So, you know, we have a lot. I mean, from Latin America, I would say, alongside Paulo Freire, I'll never forget the work of Gabriela Mistral from Chile. So, you know, from Chile, who worked and wrote great poetry, but also worked a lot in terms of education, popular education, rural teaching, for example, which did not go through the formalities of your conventional city-oriented teaching. So, you know, what I'm trying to say is there's more than just Freire, you know, in terms of sources that provide us with much grist for the mill in terms of what we're interested in. I'm assuming that many of us are interested in popular education. Popular education is extremely important for any form of democracy, especially when we talk about now, given that the lack of interest that we see in many places in political parties who have all become mainstream practically, you know, with a few notable exceptions, hopefully. Hopefully there are more than a few, but that's what I see. And they buy into the neoliberal project. You know, socialist parties, so-called ones, socialist parties have sold out. You know, I mean, what's socialist today in Europe? And basically, there's a lot of, you know, although I still think that parties are extremely important in the present moment. At the present moment, I still think that I see a lot of quite a groundswell amongst social movements. For instance, just to give you one example, I find a much greater global perspective among social movements in terms of what we produce, how we distribute, etc., climate change, than, for example, organized political situations like the European Union, where they talk about a social Europe at the expense of a social world. You know, I mean, you know, it's not enough to have simply a social program within the confines of a particular barrier, of a particular boundary, and then not bother about the resonance that this has on the rest of the global world, you know? So, I mean, the project, the socialist project, I call it, and I make no bones about it, a real genuine socialist project, is still there in my mind, and I'm sure in the minds of many of others, but it has to be an international project in the real sense of the word, the true sense of the word, not a regional or you know, regional project or a national project, God forbid, or a continental project, but it has to be the rest of the world, because what happens here has a resonance on the other side. And maybe for Paulo Freire, this is an aspect of Paulo Freire which needs to be looked at seriously. I mean, Paulo Freire's work in the latter stages of his life was very much concerned with human and the rest of the earth relations. It doesn't come across in his early work in pedagogy of the oppressed. It does not. And it has been criticized for all its great elements that it has. It still remains the best book produced by Paulo Freire, especially the first 3 chapters. Because the 4th chapter, I argue, and I have people who disagree with me on this, like Antonia Darder, she disagrees, the 4th chapter is a grafted on piece. And there's a story behind it, because apparently the publisher wanted him to deal with Fanon and the works of Albert Memmi. I don't see that dialectical streak running into that 4th chapter, but I do see the greatness of that book in terms of how his thought and mode of analysis is wedded, it is reflected in the language itself. There's this connection between, for example, when we talk about dialectic, you actually see it throughout the work itself, dialectic. My late friend, Paula Ullman, wrote a lot about this. And when we talk about relationships, we are not talking about binary relationships in Freire. We are talking about dialectical relationships. They cannot have one without the other in a contradictory situation. And the struggle is now how to try to reconcile them. How far can you go in reconciling those relationships, which is, of course, it comes from others. It comes from Marx. It comes from even some of the Greek philosophers who influenced Marx. So, but on the other hand, he's being criticized because he was a man of his times. And basically, okay, we know about the gender issues which were raised a lot, but also the ecological issues. The vision is still anthropocentric in that early work. It doesn't mean we do away with that work. That work is, I think it still remains valid. It's probably one of the best books written as far as how shall I put it, colonialism and colonialism, not just the last chapter, because it runs through about oppression that you, together with a book that Chris Kavanagh had highlighted to me once, and which I read with gusto, and it influenced my thinking, Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America, and of course, Wretched of the Earth, etc. But what I did see in Freire's later work is his commitment, both as a Secretary of Education when he was appointed by the mayor who won the municipal election, the vote for the mayor, Luisa Erundinia, towards ecological issues. So when we talk about dialogue, when we talk about dialogue, and I'm talking about dialogue in a broad sense, we are not just talking about dialogue about humans, amongst humans, but dialogues with the rest of the earth. Now, some people will tell you, true rationalists to my liking, that you cannot dialogue with nature. Well, first of all, we are all part of nature. That's one thing we have to fight against. This capitalist mantra that nature is apart from us, meaning, therefore, we can exploit it. And we can see with what results. So we are part of nature. And yes, the rest of nature does dialogue with you, with a language which is different from yours. You know, it speaks a different language. You mess up with nature, with the rest of nature, you suffer the consequences. That's her response, or his, you know, if we're going to give it some kind of gender embodiment. So, and I remember a discussion about this at UCLA once, where somebody said, you cannot discuss with nature. That is why he tried to defend Freire from the accusation of being anthropocentric. Come on, of course you dialogue with nature. The mystics of the medieval period, like Francis of Assisi, did dialogue with nature, but you have to dialogue on not just on your own terms, but on its own, on the terms of the rest of nature. I say rest of nature, which makes my sentences convoluted and complicated, because we tend to forget that we are part of nature. We are part of nature. We are rooted in nature. Capitalism, as Marx indicates, has created this artificial separation between us humans and the rest of nature, as if we are separate from. This is something to bear in mind when we try to tackle the issues that we face today. And the one thing I like about Paulo Freire in his later work is that taking on this cosmic dimension. Now, of course, we can draw on other writers inspired by Freire who have really then boosted because of their insights. Our thinking about the situation. People like Edmund O'Sullivan, people like Thomas Berry, Darling Clover, just to mention a few names. I mean, the list can go on and on. There's been a fantastic book published again at quite an expense, hardback, published by in my series, the series I edit, and I hope it becomes more accessible, called Eco-Pedagogy by Greg Maziarek, about the situation. So they are elaborating on Freirean themes there, because many of these authors consider themselves as being Freirean. And I find this very fascinating, because it takes us beyond now purely social relations to human, rest of the earth relations. One of the first persons in adult education, the field in which a number of us work, who wrote about this, I would never say she was the first person in the English language, or because that's very dangerous to be absolutizing. You never know, you come up with something before this, was Gabriela Mistral, I would say. And later in adult education, I would say, there was a German scholar living in England, living in the United States. Please forget me, I'm getting these lapses. I'm getting these mental lapses, honestly. I might even forget my daughter's names. You know, honestly, I'm at that stage in my life where I just can't get the word, which is on the tip of, the person I know, etc. And honestly, it's there. But you probably figure out who this person is. She wrote this book in the early 90s. She was very much active in the adult education field. And it will come. Don't worry, it will come. So I'll probably interrupt my own statement later on by reminding you who the person is. And it's terrible, this. Hope it's not the beginning of dementia, but anyway. This is one of the great things about Paulo Freire, I think, his work, because it offers great possibilities. And this was before the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Freire, and this allows us to elaborate on Paulo Freire in terms of how his conception of authentic dialogue and what he called difference in diversity, unity in diversity. I don't like the word unity. I prefer harmonization within diversity, because unity is a bit too, it's too what's the word? I find it totalizing in this respect as well. So I prefer harmony, where the different elements retain their identity, and we can elaborate on that and say, well, unity in biodiversity. And I find this can take us forward in terms of the Freirean conception. Now, of course, what this results in, and here I am even looking at my PowerPoint. Well, I can give you the PowerPoint afterwards. You can go through it. This is my style always. I prepare a PowerPoint, but then I don't, I just, is basically, if we have to imagine a world, un mundo menos feo, menos malvado, menos deshumano, with Paulo Freire's words, less ugly, very simple, less ugly, less savage, less unhuman. I think we have to look at this global vision of oppression that Paulo Freire has. It's been an important element. I would argue that his later books, later to Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Cultural Action for Freedom, are elaborations on some of the themes, the fundamental themes that he talks about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, because of various things, different experiences, especially when he was in exile, different criticisms, which came from various sources, and he responds to criticisms in this regard. I mean, think of the feminist movement and the criticisms of many people, people in popular education themselves, in Latin America, Vanilda Paiva and other people like that. And then you have also the ecological movement, environmental movement, etc. And he's always fine-tuning, if you like, the basic elements which already existed in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the issue of the dialectic and how to have to work with, within this dialectic, how to look at the world as built on relations. And it's not just social relations, which is extremely important, but goes beyond that in terms of the social and the non-human relations. This is very interesting. I think also in this age today of, digitally mediated knowledge, Paulo Freire can also be interesting, and there's some interesting work because, it's not in Paulo Freire, but how people took up Freire's ideas and moved into different other areas. I mentioned literature earlier on. We're talking about now communications and digitally mediated technology, etc. Lots of work is being carried out there. How do you do dialogue in this situation? Now we're working our ways through digitally mediated technology because of COVID. I mean, what COVID did, it forced us, many of us, who were very probably skeptical of the new technologies, to use them with all the limitations and highlight them, and therefore now use a Freirean lens to look at the limits and possibilities of the situation, that we don't become co-opted within this neoliberal process, also through digitally mediated technology. Basically, is keep your ultimate vision in sight, which is a vision which transcends the capitalist framework, even though you are not going to see that capitalist framework change completely. It will change. It does change. That's how hegemony works. You are renegotiating relations of hegemony. So it's changing all the time. It's in flux. But we're not going to see the end of capitalism in our lifetime, probably. It's much easier to imagine, as Frederick Jameson says, the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Of course, maybe I am also being sucked into that. But basically, there's a lot of work. There are a lot of interesting work being carried out. You can't expect one person like Paulo Freire in a particular moment in time, whatever, to have to elaborate these insights in various fields, but there are so many others. There's a Freirean tradition which is growing and ever growing. And it's not just talking about basic literacy, which, by the way, let's not forget, ensconced as some of us are in a highly literate, conventionally speaking, and now highly new basic skills literate, if I'm going to use the European Union language, which I abhor. But you can't expect him to provide all the answers, but there are other people who build on Paulo Freire's vision in terms of and make a lot of and have done progress in this regard in terms of carrying the discourse forward. And I think that's what we can do, because we also operate from different contexts. And as you know, and despite the messages we get from big organizations of a one-size-fits-all, we all know that education, not just popular education, all education is context-driven. When I used to teach in the schools many years ago, every school represented a different challenge because the context was different. So it militates against the one-size-fits-all kind of strategy about which we are being bombarded. Okay, we are being bombarded. We have these best practices, supposedly. We also have these this regime of evaluation, the evaluator state, which is a measuring state, often very positivist in its approach, all right? Even when they talk about quality indicators, when people talk about quality indicators, and I'm talking about the European Union because that's the one I'm familiar with because of my location and my country's position within this union. They talk about quality. They used to talk about quality indicators in lifelong learning, and I was involved in one of these working groups. And I got really completely fed up. And I went back home and I said, listen, send somebody else because I'm not interested anymore. They were not interested in what we brought to the table. Of course, my thinking was very much influenced by Paulo Freire and others, not just Paulo Freire. I mean, come on. But there are many others. And we know, like, they talk about quality indicators, but everything they provide from the commission, which is what they want at the end, despite our working group and all the representations we make, etc., they all come back to trying to justify the original situation. And then this was the last straw when somebody said, listen, I said, how are we going to use a different methodology to look at the complexity of a situation, which is context bound? And somebody this was the last straw, said, I've never heard of a qualitative method, a qualitative indicator. And I said, geez, what the hell are we doing here? So I went back, I never liked Brussels, quite honestly. And I said, look, count me out. I mean, just send somebody else if anybody's interested, because we're getting nowhere about this with this. So here we use the word quality indicators. As usual, we go for the quantitative kind of thing. And of course, the methodology, how do you separate the two, chicken and the egg, suits the vision. And the vision is a one-size-fits-all strategy, which creates all kinds of issues also in terms of north-south imbalances, even within Europe itself, let alone the rest of the world. Okay? So where does Paulo Freire come to this? Of course he comes to this, the antithesis to all this. He is the antithesis towards this. For my sins, I wrote a paper which published in a book edited by Carlos Alberto Torres, a handbook of Paulo Freire. I hope I can get these ideas. I can have this somehow rewritten, rehashed at a much more popular level. This is the problem with these publications, and you have to survive within the academia, is who reads them. We reproduced it in a small book, a pivot book now, Leona English and myself, Paulo Freire and the debate on lifelong learning. Now, as you know, today, lifelong learning is one of the biggest buzzwords, okay, that we have everywhere in education. Mostly in Europe, I'd say, mostly in Europe, but also elsewhere. We tend to forget that once UNESCO had a much more expansive with an A, expansive vision of lifelong education, idealistic as much as you like, it's also has its infelicities, I would say, because they lend themselves, it was a bit too individualizing, and they lend themselves to neoliberal appropriation. Only a few spoke about collectively directed learning. And I'm using collective in the Freire sense, because there's what I call a positive form of collectivity, social movements, you know, the old and new, whatever, labor movements, etc., coming together, working together, the whole idea that one does not liberate oneself on one's own, but in concert with others, which is, and when I say others, it is other people and also other species in concert, now bearing in mind the needs of the planet Earth. And at the same time, and we have this kind of, and then there's the other negative side of collectivity, this kind of thing we associate with mass hysteria that people like Theodor Adorno wrote in Education After Auschwitz. So one has to draw a distinction there. Just like when we talk about populism, we don't lump all populism in the, you know, together, because there is the kind of populism a la Trump and many other people, Bolsonaro in Brazil, if we're talking about Paulo Freire, but then there is also what Chantal Mouffe calls left-wing populism. I mean, the populism which we had in Latin America, although really keeping structures in place, when Paulo Freire was very active in Angicos and was later called on, we're talking about the early Freire here, was later called on to create a program of literacy, which would have been political in itself, even without the conscientization. Okay, it would have been political because it would have changed the electoral landscape of Brazil, which meant that therefore, and that's why it was introduced by a populist government, that offered great possibilities for mobilization. Okay, whatever the leaders of the country intended, it offered great possibilities, and that is why it was killed by a coup d'etat. Because obviously the place was not going to be profitable anymore for the multinationals over there. So no wonder the military was called on to stage a coup d'etat, probably engineered by the CIA, not probably, definitely I would say, and other companies, you know, giants like the fruit selling companies like we had later in Chile, for example. So, you know, one has to be very careful. But then on the other hand, what we have is, I juxtapose in this piece, Paulo Freire's conception of learning, which I call a lifelong praxis, because that's a very central concept, which I believe I refer to in this piece here, and this PowerPoint, and of course, the kind of lifelong learning which is promoted by the European Union, but which is also promoted by other entities in other parts of the world. You know, very much lifelong learning because of the situation in terms of employment. You know, I mean, people are living in certain countries like Europe, in many countries in Europe, with the exception of Turkey, the population is getting older. So there's going to be a huge demand on the welfare state. The welfare state has disappeared because it finds it unsustainable. So we send out the mantra that, you know, like people over 60 should keep on working for their own dignity, which is, of course, there is some truth to it, but the reality, let's not kid ourselves, is that the state considers keeping those people living is unsustainable. Hence, the pensions become an individual rather than a social responsibility, which is then also a reflection of what takes place via lifelong learning. We all know this. Lifelong learning has been used by these institutions of capital, I'd say, even if there is some debate, because institutions are not monolithic, as is the EU. I recognize, I mean, things have been challenged. There are different layers of policy making. There are different groups with different interests. So, you know, it's not that straightforward. It's not that monolithic. But we know that this is precisely putting the responsibility onto the individual. What in England used to be called, and other places, responsibilization. You are responsible for your own good. So in other words, if you are unemployed, that's your responsibility, not the responsibility of a social state which has been dismantled. And I'm using the word social state. The English would say, or the Brits would say, a welfare state, because that's how it's used in the rest of Europe. That's been dismantled, and therefore, because the nation state, which has not gone away, that's a myth we have to look at. You know, the idea that now the nation state is now finished, now we're a global, come on. Look at the migration issue and tell me where is the emphasis placed now? It's basically on the nation state. That's why you have different rules. That's why you don't have a common policy about migration. Okay, when banks go bust, it's the national state which comes in to save them, and provides bonuses for those who actually created this mayhem in the first place, as we have seen with the fiscal crisis. So, and that's where I think we need Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire has a very interesting insight on this. He was very prescient in terms of dealing with the bank crisis and how the state is there. The state is always there, but we have dismantled it to the extent that, in the sense that we made it seriously change its priorities. The state, the national state in most countries, was no doubt a bourgeois state. Its main concern was the accumulation of capital. But it had to listen to the cries of other people who wanted a share of the cake. So post-war, we had the welfare state. Before that, in America, you had the New Deal. Either this or else. You know, either this or else. So it was a concession by capital to labor, but it was also a victory by labor, by cornering capital to provide an alternative. Now that has been dismantled, because now the priority of the state is creating the infrastructure for the mobility of capital. That's the major concern. So all of a sudden, the language on education becomes how to attract investment and maintain it and keep it. So all of a sudden, of course, the scenario has changed and has contributed to this, which is the technological revolution, which some people refer to as the third industrial revolution, before now supposedly the fourth one, the World Economic Forum are talking about. So, you know, this is the kind of language which is contrasted by the more humanist, ecologically sensitive language emerging from the Freirean tradition, where the focus is on people, where the focus is on the rest of nature, where the focus is on living a fruitful democratic life, where your citizenship has multiple subjectivities. You are not simply reduced to a producer and consumer. You do not become a one-dimensional or two-dimensional person in Marcuse's sense. And this is where he represents a contrast. But of course, that contrast doesn't go down well in the world of expedience, of political expedience, which unfortunately leads many organizations, and I'm talking about labor parties in this respect, especially the one I come from a country which now supposedly has a labor government. This is neoliberal as hell. And basically, not only, and also probably also contaminated by criminal involvement. Because you see, when you hobnob with business, unfortunately, this is a reality. You know, when business people call the shots because of the situation, you're going to get all kinds of people in bed with the politicians. Very difficult to separate the two. So, you know, Paulo Freire represents a much broader vision, a vision which doesn't last 5 years only to win an election, even though he was a politician himself. He was a part of a municipal government which depended on the government at the federal level. And it gives us a broader, you know, I mean, what about the idea of fighting for one's principles, losing elections for further gain down the road? You know, sometimes it pays to lose an election if you want to fight for your ideals. I mean, for instance, nobody would touch the migration issue. And we know this is a human tragedy. This is a human tragedy. But to solve that situation, you know, I mean, it's not just simply saying, let's invest more in Africa. Come on. I mean, first we ravage a continent. Or as somebody once wrote in a very guttural language, in one of those comments to pieces in Counterpunch. First we F a whole place. And when the F'd up come to our place, we'll tell them to F off. You know what I mean? Sort of for Christ's sake. And then on the other hand, we don't care about the planet. We've destroyed the planet. I mean, we don't, climate change has reached proportions where it becomes unlivable in certain parts of the world. And you don't expect to have massive migration. I would argue we ain't seen nothing yet. If the predictions by scientists are to be taken on board, people talk about 1.5 heat rises. People are saying, forget about that. By the end of this century, it will be 4.5. So, I mean, this is unlivable. So you're not going to expect the migration issue to continue and become, you know, and this is it. But politicians don't deal with these issues. Politicians, they're only interested in winning the next election. So if people are, the local autochthonous population is being terrified by the myths promoted by capitalist spokesperson or organic intellectuals in a Gramscian sense, your market researchers, your market persons, etc., that these guys are taking your job, this creates a bifurcation within the working class. The autochthonous working class and the rest of the working class coming from other places, the migrants. We forget that we're all in the same boat in the situation. My exploitation and your exploitation, you are probably exploited more than I am as a member of the autochthonous population, in my case, the Maltese population, but, you know, we're being exploited and we are pointing our guns at the wrong people. Misplaced alliances. We are told to align ourselves with capital, national capital, when capital is international, okay? National capital against the competition, both in terms of investment and supposedly, and in terms of the labor market, divide and rule situation, strategy. So Paulo Freire, I think, together with others, now, come on, I mean, there's so many other people who have been writing about this stuff, will help those who want to listen, can help us or inspire us, because nobody gives you a blueprint. You have to find that according to your context, but you need that source of inspiration. And for me, Freire is more inspiration than anything else. The inspiration, and not just Paulo Freire. I write a lot about Lorenzo Milani. We have a lot in this part of the world, by the way. I mean, Spain has given us many people. Okay, just think of the Second Republic again, you know? if we find inspiration from these sources, there could also be not individuals, there are movements most of the time to challenge these myths. And for me, reading The Word and the World, the famous mantra by Paulo Freire, which has always been at the heart of critical thinking and education, is precisely to read through the myths of capitalism. There are many of these. The list is legion. Okay, where do we start? The slogans. Some people consider this to be very intelligent. Oh my God. Classical neoliberal responsibilization. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. How innocent, how naive. What it means is basically, as you know, I'm just underlining what everybody knows, people of a critical bent, is, education is no longer a public good. It's a consumption good, which gives you a position as well in society in terms of positioning yourself, because now freedom is in consumption. The freedom is no longer a collectivity fighting for change, not on one's own, but in concert with others, but it's basically positioning myself so I could have not even I could incur so many debts because I live a precarious existence. I can't plan ahead, but I consider myself to be middle class, even though I came from a middle class family, which has become déclassé, right? But I have no conscience of my situation. I run into debts because I want to maintain myself as being, which makes it very difficult then to have class consciousness. Of course, it's very difficult today to have class consciousness. I mean, the world today, the cities today are not the cities you had in Turin in the first part of the 20th century, the first 20 years, which led to the Biennio Rosso. Of course, because now people have become, even liberation has become individualized. And Paulo Freire, with his emphasis on the collective, provides an antidote to that. And the other one would be also how to read through these slogans. I'm just having a look at the time. No, I think I should stop here. 12:07. I went beyond. Sorry, I went beyond my 45 minutes.
Peter, 5 minutes, please.
Huh?
5 more minutes, please.
Un bis.
No, only 5 minutes to finish.
Yeah, un bis. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
All right, give us 5 minutes. Well, so here you are. I mean, so you can see how relevant Freire is today. But I would argue any criticality is the most relevant point. We associate Freire with criticality, but there's so many writers about criticality. Thank God, those people have not gone away. And the writers are not just in education or popular education. One of the things that I share with my students is this point. Yes, read the literature on popular education. Yes, read Freire, but read others from other sources. So I mentioned Eduardo Galeano. I would mention, if I'm talking about, okay, we question now what is not just how we are producing, but what we are producing. Soil, Not Oil by Vandana Shiva. But these are my choices, If I'm looking at the issue of migration and race today, I cannot think of a better starting point apart from the writings which we have on race, etc. Du Bois in North America, as how it's pronounced, and all these people. Toni Morrison's Beloved is the one novel that I would read. I mean, come on. So the sources are various. It depends also on your interests, on what your background is. And we need this. So let's not give Paulo Freire powers he does not have and which he would not like, he himself. I mean, Freire is to be read, but has to be read not in isolation from others. In social theory, in literature, whatever. Maybe in science and technology, because there are critical people there, but I'm not going to talk about them because I don't know much. about that. I'm an ignoramus in that field. You know, I mean, Jesus, I mean, so let's not just, you know, let's not give people powers that he does not have. He would argue, Paulo Freire, don't give education powers he does not have. That's another thing. The rhetoric of education, which is used by the right, unfortunately also by the left. I'm genuine left. I'm talking about who's left really of the left. But anyway, okay. But again, there again, we forget the warning that Paulo Freire and many others is basic in sociology of education. Education on its own does not change things. It is an important contributor to change, but not on its own. Not even from an economic perspective. That's one of the big myths. Invest in education was one of the big myths of the World Bank. Invest in education, and there is no takeoff. Of course, because the whole situation is very complex. You can have investment from an economic perspective in education, but you don't have the infrastructure to absorb the product of that education. And therefore, what we have is the continuation of a colonial policy, because the best brains then remain abroad. So not only are they sucking your resources, physical resources, but also your people. I hate to use the word human resources, but your people, because they remain there, as if they don't have much, the rich countries already. You know, so that's another myth. The other myth is the myth of education and the state. This is something where you read the world differently from the way it's being presented to us. Andy Green, a good friend of mine, professor of lifelong learning at the Institute of Education, UCL, wrote a book called Education and State Formation. And he does empirical work, case studies involving many countries, including those in Southeast Asia. The myth which is going around is leave everything to the market. The withdrawal of the state. Well, that's a big myth. Because this is based supposedly, as also in issues of development in the past, on the stages that the wealthy countries, or those which did very well economically, have gone through to reach the stage they are in now. And what it shows that, contrary to the discourse provided, the mantra, it is not so much, it's not the withdrawal of the state from education which has provided, but on the contrary, very much contrary to what is being asserted, many of these countries build their education on the backs of a strong state, which can be traced back even to the capitalist countries in Europe, England, Germany, you name it. They all built their system on the back of the strong state. And now we're putting out, I would say the global hegemonic discourse is precisely that let's do away with the state. It's one big lie. So there's your 5 minutes, Emilio. So I think the biggest legacy is how to read the world and to read them through the myths. And of course we have, I'm concluding. Of course, we have things to fight against because we have now the world global media, how it's been used and how often even those who attack the current regimes of truth, we have to discuss them critically, as we've seen via Trump. You know, I mean, who is providing the attack and where it's coming from? And the other myth is also when you have these uprisings, like you had in the Arab world, in many places in the Arab world. Tunisia might have worked, but Egypt certainly not. So in other words, you have to ask a very important question, not a Freirean, a Gramscian question. This. You have spontaneous uprising, spontaneity. Good. Where is the conscious direction coming from? Could be one organization, could be a network of organizations. many revolutions have taken trajectories which were very different from the popular expectation. Look at the Iran revolution. There were Marxists, there were anarchists, there were all sorts involved. Where did it go? Somebody was providing conscious direction behind the scenes. And we know who did that. The Brotherhood in Egypt, etc. So one has to be, it's not enough to be spontaneous. It can go either way. And most likely it takes a conservative way. We look at history. So you have to ask, who's providing the coordination? Who's providing the conscious direction? That's what Gramsci talks about. You have to have this interplay between and balance between with spontaneity and conscious direction. Paulo Freire tried this when he became a member of the Partito Trabajadores, the Workers' Party. But then, of course, you have to be careful. What happens within the Workers' Party? Was it also co-opted by neoliberalism? Did it become part of progressive neoliberalism? How do we look at progressive neoliberalism? It creates certain changes for the good, but the larger picture remains neoliberal. Here in Malta, we've been very good on LGBTQ rights, and on women's rights, great. I'm not disputing that, but the overall picture is a purely capitalist imagination, a capitalist idea. So in other words, in terms of the society, and of course, the ultimate change in society, long-term goal, the healthy utopia, which prevents your criticism or critique in the sense of both possibilities and limits from becoming cynicism, that has to be broader than that. It has to be a larger picture, that larger vision, global cosmic vision that Paulo Freire worked towards and has been promoting, and which is probably one of his greatest legacies, together with the legacies of people like Thomas J. Berry, God rest his soul, and others who have done much to carry this forward. Edmund O'Sullivan in Canada, Chris knows these people very well, and many others. And there are similar people all over the world doing this eco-pedagogy, Cruz Prado and Gutierrez, etc. So, oh, by the way, I remember that German professor is Mechthild Hart, who I just have this lapsus. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much. We have almost 45 minutes to dialogue, that this is important, talking on Freire. I would like, before to open the floor, and we have a long question from David Greenwood in the chat, but maybe David can say something about. But I would like to say something about one of the last thing that you say, that it is read Freire and others. And I would like also to remember that this 2021 is also the centenary of the birth of Raymond Williams. That in all
it's the centenary. Raymond Williams, what? The birth?
Yes, of the birth of Raymond Williams. And Raymond Williams,
one of my favorite writers, of course.
In our country is a little forgot, and this is Freire is a kind of shadow all the other authors, and I think when you say this,
oh, you mean the cherry on the cake? The cherry on the cake, or yeah,
Freire and others. I remember and underline Raymond Williams, for instance, that it is